Hello, and welcome to Solve Climate by 2030, an initiative begun by Iban Goodstein of Bard College as a national event during which every state would host dialogues aimed at finding solutions to climate by 2030. This is the Power Dialog for Climate Solutions for New Jersey, hosted by the Sustainability and Environmental Studies programs at Ramapo College of New Jersey, sponsored by the Center for Sustainability at Ramapo College and Sustainable Jersey City, a collaborative network, a nonprofit organization in Jersey City dedicated to the implementation of sustainability across the board within the city of Jersey City. Why 2030? So back in 2018, October 8th, 2018, the UN IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, released a series of documents that argued that we have 12 years. At that time, they argued that we have 12 years to limit climate change. The world's leading climate scientists had warned at that time that we had a dozen years for global warming to be checked to 1.5 degrees Celsius global mean temperature. Since then, 2 years have passed. We're now in 2020, and we have 10 years left of that 12-year warning that we were given in 2018. So this event is going to play out in this manner. We're going to, from 6 o'clock to 7 o'clock, we're going to do a power dialogue. There'll be a series of speakers, which I will introduce in a minute. Then we will do breakout rooms, 3 breakout rooms specifically, which I will describe to you in a minute. And then we will all congregate back as a whole entire group to do a report out on what we discovered in the breakout rooms. So the power dialogue itself, my name is Ashwani Vasishth, and I head the Center for Sustainability at Ramapo College of New Jersey. I'm also Associate Professor of Sustainability at Ramapo College, and I am joined here today by a wonderful panel of 8 speakers. Dr. Michael Edelstein, the Institute for Environmental Studies at Ramapo College of New Jersey and a professor of environmental psychology. Alexa Torres, an eco-feminist climate activist and an alumni of Ramapo College. Harriet Shugarman, who heads Climate Mama and is also an adjunct professor at Ramapo College. We have Lynne, who heads Young Voices for the Planet, an organization committed to focusing attention on youth, K-12 particularly. Then we have 2 really wonderful people, Paula Rogovin, who is a grassroots activist, and Matt Smith, who heads up the New Jersey arm of Food and Water Watch. We also have Jeff Tittel of Sierra Club and Amanda Novello of Sustainable Jersey City. So they will talk first. Mike and Alexa will do a level setting and lay out a context for this evening. Then Harriet and Lynne will talk about transforming education, which is one of the breakout rooms that we're going to have. Then Paula and Matt are going to speak specifically to the issue of stopping fossil fuel infrastructure and switching to renewable. Then Jeff and Amanda are going to talk about state and municipal actions for climate change. Jeff is going to focus on the state policy overview, and Amanda is going to focus specifically on the city of Jersey City, where we have been doing a lot of work in terms of sustainability and climate action. The breakout groups, as I mentioned before, there will be 3 of them: transforming education, stopping fossil fuel infrastructure and promoting renewable, municipal and state action. And then we will all come back, report to the entire group the top 3 actions that emerged from our breakout rooms. So welcome officially to Solving Climate by 2030, Envisioning New Jersey's Response.
I'm Mike Edelstein, professor of environmental psychology at Ramapo College, and I'm here to discuss setting the context for our discussion of solving climate by 2030. I wanted to start out by looking at the context we're in right now, the coronavirus pandemic. And when I began revising the 3rd edition of my book, Contaminated Communities, I realized that I had started that book, interestingly enough, by citing Daniel Defoe. In a journal of the plague year, Daniel Defoe chronicled the transformation of everyday life caused by the Great Plague of London of 1665, which killed some 100,000 people. As early news of the plague abroad reached them, Londoners nervously began to watch the bills of mortality. The weekly reports of number and cause of deaths in each parish, which served as indicators of the plague's approach. Many fled the plague, leaving the city comparatively empty. The wealthiest were most likely to be able to leave. Others employed in the trades or lacking resources were generally forced to remain, only to face unemployment resulting from the disruption of London's economy. A plague culture emerged within London. Fear of strangers became the norm. Parents, not knowing they were diseased, inadvertently infected their children. The Lord Mayor began shutting up sick people in their houses on July 1st, 1665. No one knew how the infection spread, so various superstitions emerged. People came to define any suspicious occurrence or symptom in light of the plague. Not only was the daily life of Londoners dramatically affected by the plague, but their entire way of seeing and comprehending the world was altered. The psychological and social dynamics of combining uncertain, invisible, and unpredictable environmental causes and dreaded consequences was well demonstrated by these events. I know this all sounds familiar, and my goal here was to really talk about contamination as a new plague. And now we need to look similarly at climate change and think about climate change as a collection of myriad plagues affecting health and habitability, causing connected yet asynchronous and diverse, global and local, cumulative, unpredictable yet certain, and escalating exponentially over time. Climate change is something that we now need to think of as a double whammy on top of coronavirus. Now, why this focus on 2030? My colleague Ashwani Vasishth referred to this, but in fall of 2018, we have what we could call the 4 horsemen of the apocalypse, 4 reports that came out in a 2-month period, which really demonstrated the importance of 2030. The United Nations Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, Special Report 15, and their 9th emissions gap reports demonstrated that we already have suffered global warming of 1 degree centigrade beyond pre-industrial times with significant climate change. That we are already reaching or about to reach 1.5 degrees centigrade as early as 2030, and we could easily overshoot that to 2 degrees centigrade with dramatic consequences. And to see a reduction by 2030, global greenhouse gas emissions would need to be reduced by 55% if we wanted to stick to 1.5, or 25% if we wanted to not go past 2 degrees centigrade. The chart in the middle shows that. The U.S. Climate Assessment Report was the 3rd report, and this showed very similar predictions to the UN. Focusing on our region, the Northeast, the report said that we would be the worst hit. We would have increased precipitation, flooding, and heat. We would have massive failures of infrastructure. We would have climate refugees, needs for reconstruction, heat-related deaths, disruption of service and resource supply infrastructure, resulting in a lower quality of life economic decline, and increased social inequality and loss of public services. And if we didn't change things, by the end of the century, we could have as much as a 5 degrees Celsius, a 9 degree Fahrenheit change. So the fourth report, which was from the Lancet, which is a British health journal, basically looked at the impacts of climate change, and it showed those changes being raised average temperatures, altered rainfall patterns, ocean acidification, sea level rise, extreme weather, and other air pollutants, all driven by rising temperatures. And the secondary impacts of this were things like flooding, a loss of fish, reduced physical work because of the heat, ecosystem collapse and loss of biodiversity, agricultural loss, and increase of pests, heat waves, drought, fire, increased particulate pollution, ozone increases, increased allergy, all of which would create a whole set of health conditions ranging from bacterial diarrhea, undernutrition, mental health consequences, cardiovascular, respiratory, and vector-borne diseases, and harmful algae blooms, all of which would interact with social factors like loss of habitat, poverty, mass migration, violent conflict, etc. So we see that this 10-year window that we now have is extremely consequential. Drawing on my work on the Aral Sea disaster, which was a dry run for climate change, we see here that on the right, we have our social awareness of environmental change on the left. And looking at that social awareness, we are generally unaware, or we ignore or resist the consequences of environmental changes around us, changes that we should be monitoring and which should elicit effective action. But by not acting, we adapt to changes as they occur. We miss opportunities to address them. We finally begin to focus when crisis occurs and there's signs of danger. We mobilize a late response when there's acute threat. And we then engage when a disaster occurs, an emergency response, survival, and coping. We see this with the COVID disaster, and we see this with climate change, and the time to act is before there's too little too late.
So my name is Alexa Torres. I am a intersectional eco-feminist activist, change agent. I'm a graduate of Ramapo College. I'm a U.S. Forest Service wildland firefighter. I'm a writer. I'm a Hudson County, New Jersey native. I'm a food grower, Puerto Rican and Colombian woman with Taino ancestry. I'm the sound of the coqui in the night, native to Puerto Rico. I'm the color of a little café con leche in the morning, and I'm a 21st century American millennial trying to make a loving home on this planet for themselves and others. I share my story with you because I believe that sharing stories is an ancient way to opening the door to real human and soul connection. And what better way to open than with that, I think. I present this info as a way for those who may not be informed on environmental justice to become familiar, and for a way in which I think current professionals in the environmental field can better understand the struggle of those we have coined the most vulnerable, whom face the most discrimination. To begin with Dr. Robert Bullard, he is known as the father of environmental justice. So he believes climate justice is the #1 problem of the 21st century. It is an equity issue. As we all know, it is, he believes it's the most peculiar aspect of climate change is that the populations that contribute least to the problem of climate change are most likely to feel its impacts. Such disproportionality makes it a serious social justice issue. So therein you can see the ties between the environment and social justice. And the US EPA, this is what they have to say on environmental justice. Which we are very thankful for this definition that they are on board with this. However, they have also been criticized for not acknowledging environmental justice sooner and doing more. The environmental justice movement was started by activists, scientists, thinkers, policymakers, citizens, collective of people that were frustrated with disproportionate health, environmental, and social effects on lower income and communities of color especially. So as you can see, they acknowledge that it is the fair treatment, no matter race, color, national origin, income, in relation to development, implementation, enforcement of laws, regulations, and policies. So the most vulnerable populations. They are the lower income communities and communities of color, which include poor and working class communities. Again, they're pre-exposed to higher rates of respiratory issues and cancer. Also indigenous populations, immigrant communities, elderly and disabled persons. So many of these people are also, in relation to coronavirus 19, they're now the essential workers. Essential workers, a lot of the time, their job source hubs are in areas like service industries, grocery stores, postal workers. So, and of course, many of these workers, many of the times they're a lot more stressed and not able to stay home from work and work from home. So in this case, I believe that essential is synonymous with sacrificial, being that the sacrificial of the few is for the good of the all. In this case, the all is those who can better protect themselves through PPE, working from home. And I believe that this is one of the greatest ways this government and the nation's ruling class has failed us. These populations are pre-exposed because they live in environmental justice communities with higher rates of respiratory issues, cancer due to proximity of public and private industries and services such as incinerators, highways, Superfund sites, and rail yards, to name a few from my personal experience growing up in an environmental justice community. So again, this from April 8th, we have this from the CDC, some of the newest findings, and you can see here in bold, it said that patients, similarly in the COVID net catchment population, approximately 59% of residents are white, 80% are Black, and 14% are Hispanic. However, among 580 hospitalized COVID-19 patients with race ethnicity data, approximately 45% were white, 33% were Black, and 8% were Hispanic. And this suggests that Black populations might be disproportionately affected by COVID-19. And if you look at where many of these populations are concentrated, again, it is in these environmental justice communities. So it completely makes sense. And this is just evidence that there needs to be more done for these communities. They need to be focused and centered on. So again, youth awareness. The youth are a lot more active and they've been at the forefront. Many of them believe they're at the forefront of the Green New Deal and the reason why it is so successful. And again, it's been at least 7 years since the Industrial Revolution, and we know now the Industrial Revolution was a time when basically things started to get a lot more chaotic for the earth and for all of its inhabitants. We have faster rate of spread due to internet. There's greater diversity of peoples in the US. We have recent movements of struggle, including the Black Lives Matter movement, civil rights movement, farm workers movement, and with that, we still have many of activists that are still alive today. So we have many people to look up to in regards to that. There are also increase of elected officials of color that support the Green New Deal. One of the biggest ones was Bernie Sanders, who was running for election this past year. There's also an increased frustration among urban underserved youth. There's an increase in gentrification and displacement of families. And so, of course, the youth are angry, they're frustrated, they feel disempowered, many of them in urban areas. So there's a greater mobilization through grassroots efforts as well.
Thank you. And thank you, everyone. Thank you, Alexa. Thank you, Mike. Thank you, Ashwani, for setting the stage, for reminding us of the reality of the climate crisis, and for reminding us that it impacts people very differently. I am excited to be with you now to be able to move into the sections of our Solve Climate by 2030, this first solution section, which looks at transforming education, and to be participating in this section with my dear friend, Lynne Cherry. Among the many hats that Lynne wears, Lynne is a renowned author, educator, filmmaker, and founder of Young Voices for the Planet, an organization which I am honored to serve as board chair. Young Voices for the Planet is the recommended follow-up curriculum resource for all 50 state Solve Climate by 2030 discussions taking place around the country. And we are honored to have Lynne here with us, and you'll hear directly from her shortly. What I hope to do now is to set the stage for the importance of climate education broadly as a clear path to promoting climate action. I'm opening this section wearing my hat as a professor at Ramapo College of New Jersey, the New Jersey state host for Solve Climate by 2030. I have been asked to share my experience at Ramapo College with teaching climate change, and as many of you watching our educators, college or high school students, it's critically important that, as the Solve Climate by 2030 program asks of us, that we make climate a class in every college and in every school and at every level of education. I'm thrilled and honored to share with you that at Ramapo College, we have created a class called Climate Change in Society, which in the fall of 2019 was offered for the first time as a general education course, meaning students from multiple disciplines can take this class to fulfill a general education requirement. In this class, students learn the science of our climate crisis and also policy recommendations to solve it, actions they can take collectively, individually, and together at the international, national, state, local, and community levels, actions to slow down the crisis before us. Unfortunately, teaching climate as a class to a broad and diverse student body is still a relatively novel situation, but we hope that this dialogue and others like it will make this a much more common phenomenon. And we at Ramapo College are happy to share our experiences. As you will hear from Lynne, the impact of our crisis when taught as part of a course curriculum presents many opportunities to move students to action in real and measurable ways. Teaching climate as part of general education, cross-curricular and cross-disciplines is important on so many levels. Understanding the science and identifying the civic responsibilities that come with this knowledge should be part of instruction across disciplines, and with all of your help, we can do this. Given that you're participating in this event, you likely understand that our climate emergency impacts all aspects of our lives, not only today, but for the rest of our lives. And hiding our heads in the sand and pretending it won't or it can't impact you is similar to denying COVID-19 can't touch each and every one of us. And as with COVID-19, the impacts may present differently for each of us, from the most severe to not even knowing we are affected at all. Similarly to what Alexa shared with us, as we know with our climate emergency unfolding, people and places in different parts of our country and the world are feeling the effects in different ways. Something that is critically important to teach as part of any climate class. As we work to make climate a class, including climate justice and the environmental justice must be part of this effort. Recognizing institutionalized and historic injustices that perpetuate and exacerbate global poverty also have local implications, including the right to clean air, clean water, a healthy environment, and food security. These are human rights. We all must be advocates for climate justice and a just transition to a renewable future and now. These concepts deserve and demand a prominent place in all policies and actions on climate.
I'm Lynne Cherry. I'm a children's book author and illustrator, and the director of Young Voices for the Planet and the producer of the Young Voices for the Planet film series. Kids can make a difference. Kids have power. My take-home messages from this will be that before sharing information about climate change with students, it's important to present solutions. Motivated avoidance is this when people think something is so intractable and troubling that they can't make it that it can't make a difference if they do anything about it. They're motivated to avoid hearing about it again. And that is often the case with climate change if there are no solutions presented. We need to show students and children, youth like them, to show them what they can do. This is called, this is providing role models. This is called social modeling. People must have self-efficacy before they'll take action. They have to believe that their action is going to bear fruit. They have to have self-efficacy. We have climate change, we have a climate crisis, but we also have a democracy crisis and a social justice crisis. And I'm going to be talking later about the Young Voices for the Planet film series and the Young Voices for the Planet Civic Engagement and Democracy curriculum, which is the curriculum that is endorsed by 2030. By Solve Climate by 2030. And the Civic Engagement and Democracy curriculum is freely available on our website, youngvoicesfortheplanet.com. So as we're all aware, young people are taking to the streets and they're really wanting change. And when I was doing children's books, I wrote The Great Kapok Tree. I would tell the kids about the destruction of the tropical rainforest, and I'd watch them just get totally upset about it. And I realized this was not empowering. So I started telling them success stories about kids saving forests, and this completely changed the way they were able to hear the science, because they were not motivated to avoid hearing about it, thinking that it was impossible. By seeing these other role models, they realized that, like, the kids who look like them, they could do it too. So Greta has provided a role model for a lot of kids throughout the world. I wrote this book, How We Know What We Know About Our Changing Climate, with Gary Brosh. It was all the truth, but people were pushing it away because it wasn't just about hearing the truth, it was about what were the solutions. So we have to consider the psychological effects of the dire environmental news, especially with climate change, and precede the teaching of science with success stories. Doom and gloom shuts people down. Success stories empower and motivate. Very important. So the mission of Young Voices for the Planet is to limit climate change by empowering youth to change minds, change laws, and change the world, inspired by the films in the Young Voices for the Planet series, which you can watch, as I said, youngvoicesfortheplanet.com. There's the down below, which you can watch after anytime, freely available. This was an article that I wrote, you can Google it, on motivated avoidance for the New York Times blog.earth. So I found these wonderful stories of kids. These girls, they learned about sea level rise. They did an energy audit of their school, saved their school $53,000 in energy bills. Great role models. Felix Finkbeiner learned about climate change, learned that trees sequester carbon, planted 1 billion trees. That's called Plant for the Planet. And children are changing laws, even though they are not old enough to vote. And this was the most exciting thing about these films, watching these kids. This was from Team Marine. They testified they got the first plastic bag ban in the US, and it was high school kids. These girls in Save Tomorrow, they were 9 years old, learned that their town had a law prohibiting solar panels on town buildings. They testified at their town meeting. They got a standing ovation. The law was overturned. The town then went and put solar panels on every public building. The kids got a huge solar array. They got their town to reconsider its investment portfolio, getting rid of fossil fuels, and they have just really made a big difference in this town. So children can change minds and change laws, even though they can't vote. We can't cover every story in a movie, but we have this action map, which has a lot of the other kids around the country, actually around the world, who are reducing CO2 emissions through their actions. They're all youth solutions to the climate crisis. And we hope that you'll share them. A lot of the information in the films, on the pedagogy of the films, is the research of Albert Bandura, who is the most famous living psychologist. He coined the term self-efficacy. He coined the term social modeling. So we have an article that's just coming out in American Psychologist, if you want to take a look at it, about enlisting the power of youth for climate change.
Hi, I'm Paula Rogovin. I'm from the Don't Guess the Meadowlands Coalition. I'm a retired New York City public school teacher, 44 years, and now retired to nearly full-time environmental activism. I'd like to tell you about our local efforts to stop 2 fossil fuel power plants here in northern New Jersey. Mitsubishi's proposed Meadowlands frac gas power plant, which we defeated, and Governor Murphy's New Jersey Transit power plant, which we're still fighting. Both were to be in environmental justice communities. Governor Murphy in 2018 signed an executive order to protect environmental justice communities, but we're seeing with these proposals that that is not happening. At our May 20th March for Our Lungs, high school student leader Romina Rojas said, "The construction of this power plant, the Meadowlands power plant, is just repeating the historical pattern of placing unfair environmental burdens on environmental vulnerable communities known as environmental justice communities." Why are these power plants so bad? The pollution gets into the air, the water, the lungs, and the land. It gets into our lungs. It contributes to climate change. It threatens wildlife. It harms our health, leaving people more vulnerable, especially in environmental justice communities during this, and they're heavily impacted during this COVID-19 pandemic. North Jersey is already rated F by the American Lung Association for ground level ozone or smog. This is horrendous for people with asthma, COPD, heart problems, and other health conditions. We worked in coalition with groups in North Jersey and around the state. We had constant actions, constant. We had billboards in Ridgefield, Fairview, and even on the New Jersey Turnpike. Each time we held a press conference, we held rallies, we did street theater, we did door-to-door canvassing in Bergen and in Hudson counties. Before the COVID-19 crisis, we bird dogged Governor Murphy. We went to his town halls, his press conference, and other events to try to get him to hear our demands. We, along with 60 organizations from Empower New Jersey, held Moratorium Mondays, where we urged people in the various organizations to call the governor's office and to demand a moratorium on fossil fuel projects around the state. We held educational forums. We got 52 town councils in Bergen County to pass resolutions to oppose the Meadowlands power plant. May 18th, 2019, we held a student-led march for our lungs. It went from Ridgefield Memorial High School to, in Ridgefield, New Jersey, to the site, right near the site of the proposed Meadowlands power plant. We won that fight to stop the Meadowlands power plant when Governor Murphy said that this plant did not make sense for New Jersey. But shortly after that, we learned about his proposal to put in the New Jersey Transit power plant in the Meadowlands and Kearney, an environmental justice community. If you go to nomeadowlandspowerplant.com, there are lots of ways you can learn more about this particular fight and ways you can get involved.
And greetings, everyone. My name is Matt Smith. I'm the State Director for Food and Water Watch and Food and Water Action here in New Jersey. And I'm going to be talking about a practical solution, community energy aggregation. So before I start there, just a few basics. Right now, despite the urgency of the climate crisis and the urgent need to get off fossil fuels, the state of New Jersey only sources about 5% of its electricity from clean renewable sources like solar and wind. The rest of our state's electricity is still running off of very old nuclear power plants and a majority of natural gas powered electricity, of which Paula was just talking about some of the ways that that impacts our communities. But thankfully, we have a way to, despite the inaction at the federal level and the slow action at our state level, really take power into our own hands at the local level through community choice aggregation. So what is community choice aggregation? Essentially, it allows residents of a community to bulk purchase their electricity together. By bulk purchasing, similar to going to Costco, when you buy 100 bags of potato chips, it's cheaper than buying one. By pooling our resources together at the local level, we can get cheaper rates on our electricity bills, and we can also take control of the sources of that electricity. And under community choice aggregation, a municipality would bulk buy the energy for their residents and access discounted prices. And then any resident can still opt in or opt out of the program, but this is a tool that we can use both for cost savings as well as to access more clean, renewable energy options in our communities. So here at Food and Water Watch, we've been campaigning to pass community energy aggregation policies at the local level in towns and cities across the state. We started our campaign in 2018 in New Brunswick, New Jersey. And thanks to our successful petition initiative in New Brunswick, the city council there enacted a 100% renewable energy aggregation program. And what we did was we structured it so that it didn't go to 100% renewable right away. We start off at 50% renewable and scale up to 100% by 2030. And the reason we go to 100 by 2030, we'll talk about a little later, but the reason why we created this tiered system is that this will allow residents to not only get access to clean energy choices, but we're actually seeing cost savings at the 50% renewable level. So this will allow for really everyone, low-income residents, community members in towns and cities across the state to get more access to clean energy sources while not driving up their electricity bills. And as we talked about, and really the whole frame for today is taking climate action by 2030. And so really the reports that were detailed at the beginning of the webinar talk about the urgent need to cut greenhouse gas emissions nearly in half globally by the year 2030. And fossil fuels are the #1 producer of greenhouse gas emissions globally. So by getting our towns and cities to transition to 100% clean energy by 2030, we can be part of the solution of cutting our greenhouse gases to meet those targets that we need to avoid what are called climate tipping points, right? So if we don't reduce our emissions globally in half by 2030, we'll trigger irreversible climate change due to positive feedback loops. So this is not only a very bold solution, but it's a very practical one. It's not only about fighting climate change. New Jersey's air quality is among the most polluted in the United States. The American Lung Association, for 2 years in a row, has rated New Jersey an F, failing quality for ozone pollution. Ozone pollution is linked to a whole range of lung disease, heart disease, and in fact, scientists at Harvard University this week concluded that smog pollution is actually making the COVID-19 pandemic even more deadly because it is aggravating pre-existing lung conditions caused by smog pollution. So fossil fuels is a major contributor to smog pollution. Even natural gas, which has been really falsely marketed to the United States as a clean alternative to coal, natural gas produces tremendous amounts of particulate matter and nitrogen oxides, which react with sunlight to create smog pollution, which in turn affects our lungs, makes us sick, and even kills people. So obviously we know about the urgency of the climate crisis. So by switching to clean energy at the local level, we can address these dual crises, our public health crises and our climate crises, with one practical solution.
Okay, great. I know I did it before. So hi, I'm Jeff Tittel, director, New Jersey Sierra Club, the nation's oldest and largest environmental group. We've been fighting for clean air, clean energy, and protecting public spaces for 28 years now. And I wanted to start off and say that this is also the 50th anniversary of Earth Day. And I was involved in the first Earth Day. And back then, we had rivers on fire, and now we have our house on fire with, what's happening in Brazil and Australia. Back then, because of particulates in the air, people were wearing surgical masks, and now people are wearing surgical masks because of coronavirus. So even though we made a lot of progress, we still have a long way to go. We have right now in this country, unfortunately, a fossil fool in the White House who's been blocking us moving forward on clean energy and climate change. And, when you look at our president and you realize that, he denies science, he denies climate change, and his, hair denies gravity, that, we have a serious problem. But that doesn't mean we have to give up. States themselves have tremendous amount of powers to be able to reduce and deal with climate change. And in New Jersey, We have a governor who says he's for reducing greenhouse gases, though a lot of what he's said has been hot air because they really haven't taken the bold actions that are needed and really dealt with a sense of urgency. We have to get to 45% reduction by 2030. That is a minimum mandate that we need to get to if we really want to deal with climate impacts. New Jersey is the state in the nation that has had the most climate impacts of virtually any other state. We have more homes than almost any other state, except for one, that have been built in flood-prone areas vulnerable to sea level rise. We're second in the nation for increase in temperature over the last 30 years, and we're seeing these impacts on a daily basis, whether it's fish living in storm drains on Long Beach Island or coastal wetlands disappearing or chronic flooding. We're there, and we're right in the middle of it. And so the first thing that we need to do is when your house is on fire, you need to turn off the gas, to use Greta Thunberg's line about the house being on fire. Right now, there are proposals for 15 fossil fuel projects in New Jersey, and Paula mentioned a couple of them. And if those projects get built, it'll be more than a 30% increase in greenhouse gases, not a reduction. And that's why we need to first have a moratorium. We need to have this time out so that we can then put in place the rules and regulations that we need to do to start getting us to those reductions. For instance, New Jersey has the ability to regulate greenhouse gases. They've had it since 2005. They do not have rules in place. They can also regulate methane, and they can regulate black carbon. What they need to do is, as they regulate it and develop standards, it has to be across the board, what we call life cycle, from wellhead to power plant or factory, from pipeline to automobile to refinery, and start mandating reductions. And we have that authority under what's called Title V air permits, where they can actually start ratcheting down, and we should be targeting the overburdened communities first for those reductions. Another important part that the state of New Jersey can do during this timeout is change the rules and regulations, especially those that were weakened under Christie, to make it easier to build gas pipelines and other things. And there's 7 gas pipeline projects around New Jersey. And again, not only will they promote more greenhouse gases, they'll promote more power plants and also making more plastic bags and other things that we were trying to get out of the environment. So it's critical. And we have those tools. DEP also needs to regulate greenhouse gases from land use and building permits, where people don't realize that cement itself gives off a lot of greenhouse gases, and we cut down forests for more subdivisions in the middle of nowhere. It also releases greenhouse gases. A big part of it is also going after transportation. 45% of our greenhouse gases come from the transportation sector. So not only do we have to move to get to renewable vehicles, we have to expand mass transit, electrify our bus system, and New Jersey Transit's we've been fighting them on that. But also get people to drive less to reduce VMTs. And right now, the New Jersey Turnpike Authority has a proposal to widen over 450 miles of roads. And if those lanes get built, the amount of additional driving and greenhouse gases will actually be more than 38 million tons a year, blowing out many of our reductions we're trying to get other places. So there's real important things in front of us, but we have that ability. The other point that I want to mention is that the state itself can do a lot more legislatively, as well as through other agencies like the BPU, as we ratchet up greenhouse gas reductions through moving forward with clean energy. We can also reduce the greenhouse gases. So New Jersey has the ability to build, governor's proposed about 7,500 megawatts, which is about a little over a third of our power of offshore wind. We can do 1,250 megawatts right now, and that'll be more than half our power. We can get rid of the cap on solar and allow solar to be expanded to get at least a third of our energy. So we have the ability under current tools to be able to get to 100% renewable by 2035 and at least 80% by 2030, which would get us in line with that 45% reduction.
So to introduce myself, my name is Amanda Novello. I am an economic policy analyst for a policy think tank, the Century Foundation, that aims to foster opportunity at home and abroad. I work in New York City, and I live in Jersey City. So on the federal level, I try to advocate for green investment that would mitigate climate change and create a more fair, prosperous economy at the same time. What solving climate means to me is rapidly decarbonizing all aspects of our economy in accordance with science. So in this presentation, I'm going to start with the global picture and what needs to happen by 2030, and then we'll focus on one path to getting there, which is action at the city or municipal level. So next slide, please. So this context has already been set in various ways, but I wanted to illustrate very clearly here that what solving climate looks like globally is reducing greenhouse gas emissions, cutting them in half by 2030. So this graph shows the trajectory that we needed to be on if we started seriously reducing emissions in 2010. And we could have, if we started in 2010, reducing emissions by 3.3% each year would have gotten us to our emissions reduction goal by 2030. However, we didn't do that. So next slide. The next slide shows that since we didn't do that, we have to reduce emissions more than twice as quickly starting now in order to meet that same goal. So of course, the longer we wait, you can see very clearly that it's going to be much harder to achieve this goal. Next slide. So we need coordinated structural change at every level in order to make these goals reality. So the next few slides, I'll focus on the city level. So cities are responsible for more than 70% of global energy-related CO2 emissions. So that means there's a massive emissions reduction opportunity that lies in cities. So another stat I wanted to share that's not on the slide, 90% of the world's urban areas are on coastlines, making them at high risk from rising sea levels and coastal storms. So for these reasons, cities need to really be ahead of the curve. And there are also economic and political locuses of power and can have enormous influence on and offer leadership to other cities, to states and nations. They can also sometimes be held accountable in ways that more distant levels of government might not be. So they might have closer relationships with their businesses, their local businesses, residents, and institutions than state and national governments might have. So new policies could be implemented potentially more quickly and with more urgency. Next slide. So one major effort to coordinate on the scale needed was a commitment by 10,000 mayors under the Global Covenant of Mayors. So their stated goals included decarbonizing the electricity sector by 2050, dramatically reducing emissions from buildings and transportation. And these were great goals. However, 2050 now we know is not soon enough to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So I think that one major thing cities could do to solve climate by 2030 is recommit to these goals, but raise ambition and urgency by declaring a new deadline of 2030. Next slide. So one thing that was really helpful that came out of the Global Covenant of Mayors was this way of standardizing what cities need to do to set climate action in motion. So of course, you need to start with a commitment, essentially adhering to these global goals. You need to measure citywide emissions, identify hazards, set a greenhouse gas reductions target in your own city, and develop a climate action plan to deliver on their targets. Next slide. So the next few slides, I'll focus on Jersey City. I wanted to highlight that Jersey City is currently developing a climate action plan. So it has followed this roadmap that was set up by the Global Covenant of Mayors. So what is a climate action plan? It's a process or a tool that municipalities can use to drive climate action. So it's a set of priorities, programs, and policies to create their own roadmap for achieving a climate goal. They've been implemented in many cities across the country. Jersey City is one of them. Next slide. So of course, the first thing Jersey City needed to do was understand where emissions were coming from in order to reduce emissions. Of course, you can't change what you don't know. So what Jersey City found in their emissions inventory report was basically what's in this pie chart here. So 42% of emissions in the city. So we're talking about consumption level, demand level emissions. So where were the emissions captured? So it's measuring the end use of emissions, not where they were produced. So 42% of demanded energy in the city came from commercial energy. So that's mostly buildings. The next highest sector was transportation. So there are a lot of cars on the streets in Jersey City. We do have decent public transit, but there's still a ton of cars being used. The next highest is residential energy. So there are apartment complexes more and more all the time, but there are still a lot of single family homes that are not so energy efficient. So you can read that report if you're more interested in where emissions come from at the Jersey City level. But just to move on with the process of the climate action plan. So what we did was set a target. The target in Jersey City was to reduce emissions by 80% by 2050. Next slide. So the sectors in focus in this plan, of course, were in accordance with what the findings show from the emissions report. So the climate action plan focuses on energy, transit, and land use and waste. And what the city did was create 4 working groups driven by that were really led by Jersey City residents who know about these different sectors or like intimately involved with them. And these working groups came up with recommendations to meet the broader goal of reducing emissions by 80% by 2050. There was also an equity, outreach, and community engagement group that made sure that any proposals from the other groups would not leave anyone behind or exacerbate any existing inequalities in the city. Next slide. So this is my last slide. I just want to highlight some of the benefits and limitations of working at the city level in Jersey City in particular. It's one of the largest cities in New Jersey. Again, there are a lot of emissions, so it's a big opportunity to reduce them. It's the only city in the county currently to have a climate action plan, so it can really be a regional leader. Cities and states, so a benefit is that, I mean, I guess you could call this a benefit. So cities and states really must lead because there is currently a vacuum of action at the federal level. So I guess it's just something that's heartening to see cities and states do because, you know, I think people really want to see climate action, and cities and states are now being looked to carry forward the goals that we need to be setting. So a limitation from the city level is that it's not fully in charge of its own energy mix. It's really reliant on regional energy dynamics. The timeline currently, again, is too far in the future. We need to really readjust that plan and redeclare the urgency of this problem. A problem here is that there are many renters, so they lack control over building conditions that landlords have. So it's really up to landlords oftentimes to make the changes that need to happen in terms of energy efficiency. There's a limitation in terms of political will. Obviously, every city has its own political challenges. In Jersey City, we have our own, the developers who are really driving emissions up in the city, really have a lot of political power. And lastly, there are budget limitations that might not be, you don't have the same kind of budget limitations at as the federal government. City and state budgets are much tighter and often have to adhere to balanced budget rules that the federal government doesn't necessarily have. So ideally, we would have the federal government driving a lot of these changes because they just have a lot more financial power. So that's it, and I hope to see some of you in our breakout group to figure out how to really take action at the local level. So thanks so much.